The wind howled through the ancient trees, their skeletal branches clawing at the night sky like the hands of the damned. The full moon, pale and sickly, cast eerie shadows over the abandoned Black Hollow Cemetery, a place long forgotten by the living but never truly deserted. Ethan Carter stood at the rusted iron gates, his heart pounding against his ribs. His flashlight flickered, struggling against the unnatural darkness. He knew he shouldn't be here, but curiosity was a cruel master. Legends spoke of spirits that whispered in the dead of night, of graves that moved, of something watching. "Are you sure about this?" Sarah whispered beside him, clutching her jacket against the cold. Her breath fogged in the crisp autumn air. "We came this far," Ethan replied, forcing confidence into his voice. "We need proof. The world needs to know if the stories are real." Jacob, the skeptic of the group, scoffed. "Ghost stories don't scare me. This place is just another abandoned graveyard." He kicked a loose rock, sending it skittering across the cracked pathway. As they stepped past the gate, an unnatural silence engulfed them. The wind died, the crickets ceased their song, and the world seemed to hold its breath. Then came the whisper. A faint, raspy voice, barely audible yet unmistakable. "Leave now." Sarah gasped, grabbing Ethan's arm. "Did you hear that?" Jacob chuckled nervously. "Probably just the wind." Ethan swallowed hard. "Let's keep going." With hesitant steps, they moved deeper into the cemetery, unaware that the earth beneath them was shifting, graves stirring, long-buried secrets rising to the surface. The night was far from over. The cold air pressed against them as they ventured deeper into Black Hollow Cemetery. The moonlight barely penetrated the thick canopy of dead trees, their twisted limbs resembling gnarled fingers reaching for trespassers. Ethan kept his flashlight steady, its weak beam illuminating faded headstones covered in ivy. Some were so weathered that the names had eroded, leaving behind nameless graves swallowed by time. "Why does it feel like we're being watched?" Sarah thought, but kept the words to herself. Jacob, ever the skeptic, trudged ahead. So far, no ghosts, no monsters, just a bunch of broken tombstones and... A sudden snap of a twig behind them made everyone freeze. Sarah spun around, her breathing shallow. "What was that?" The cemetery remained silent, as if listening. Ethan turned, scanning the darkness beyond the graves. "Probably an animal," he muttered, though his voice lacked conviction. Jacob laughed, though there was an edge to it. "Come on, guys. You're letting the atmosphere get to you." But Sarah wasn't convinced. As they moved forward, she kept glancing over her shoulder, certain that something was lurking just beyond their sight. Then they saw it. A mausoleum stood in the center of the cemetery, its stone walls cracked with age. A massive iron door, rusted but still intact, bore an inscription in Latin, Mortuus non permittitur red ire. Ethan traced the carved letters with his fingers. "It means, the dead shall not return." Jacob scoffed. "Dramatic." He grabbed the iron handle and pulled. The door groaned, resisting at first, but then swung open with a loud creak, revealing a yawning abyss of darkness inside. A chill ran through Sarah's spine. Maybe we shouldn't. But Jacob had already stepped in. Ethan hesitated before following, and after a moment of internal struggle, Sarah swallowed her fear and joined them. The air inside was thick with decay. The flashlight beams danced along the stone walls, revealing carvings, some depicting figures in agony, others grotesque creatures clawing at the edges of their stone prisons. Then Ethan's light landed on something that made his blood run cold. A coffin, positioned in the center of the mausoleum. Unlike the others, this one was newer, its wood unmarked by time. And then, the lid shifted. Sarah let out a choked gasp. "Oh my God!" Jacob took a step back. "No way!" Then came the whisper, louder this time, coming from within the coffin itself. "You should not be here." Ethan barely had time to react before the lid slid open on its own, revealing the hollow darkness inside. And then, a hand shot out. Ethan stumbled backward, his heart pounding wildly as the hand from the coffin reached out toward him. The air grew colder, thick with an oppressive presence that seemed to suffocate him. "Run!" Sarah screamed, grabbing Ethan's arm. But before they could move, the hand withdrew, and the coffin creaked as if alive, resisting the very pull of gravity itself. A deep, hollow voice echoed through the mausoleum, as if emanating from the earth itself. "The curse is upon you." Jacob, despite his earlier bravado, was frozen in place. His eyes were wide, his mouth agape, as he stared at the open coffin. This isn't possible," he whispered, almost to himself. "Maybe we should leave," Sarah urged, her voice shaky. Ethan nodded, his instincts screaming at him to flee. But as they turned toward the door, it slammed shut with a deafening clang, trapping them inside the mausoleum. The walls seemed to close in on them, the air growing even colder, the whispers intensifying. "Leave now or suffer." Suddenly, the darkness within the coffin shifted, and a figure began to rise, slowly emerging from the shadows. The pale face of a man, sagging and decomposed, stared at them with hollow, lifeless eyes. His mouth opened, revealing sharp, broken teeth that seemed to glisten in the pale moonlight that seeped through cracks in the stone. "Who are you?" Ethan whispered, his voice trembling. The figure did not respond with words. Instead, it began to move toward them, its every step dragging with it a low, guttural sound, a sound that seemed to vibrate in their bones. The air thickened as the figure moved, its form more than human, its limbs twisted, as though it had been corrupted by something dark and ancient. It stopped just inches from them, its cold, dead breath brushing across their skin. A raspy whisper left its lips. "You should not have disturbed the resting place of the cursed." Suddenly, the ground beneath them trembled. The mausoleum itself seemed to groan in agony, as if the entire cemetery had awakened from a long slumber. Ethan tried to reach for the door, but it remained immovable, a weight pressing against him, like the cemetery itself was holding him prisoner. "Why are you doing this?" Sarah cried, her voice barely audible. The figure's eyes glowed with an unnatural light, a flicker of something more ancient than time itself. The curse of Black Hollow Cemetery does not let those who enter leave. Once the dead are disturbed, they claim what is rightfully theirs. Jacob took a step back. "This is insane. We have to get out of here." But as he moved, the shadows shifted, crawling along the walls, and more figures appeared, rising from the tombs around them. Each one was more grotesque than the last, decomposing bodies, pale faces, and empty eyes filled with malice. The figures surrounded them, their slow, deliberate movements forming an impenetrable circle. A soft chant began to fill the air. The words were foreign, ancient, unintelligible. But their meaning was clear. They were being trapped in a ritual that they could not escape. Ethan's heart raced as he realized what was happening. It's not just the cemetery. It's the whole town. Black Hollow is cursed. Suddenly, the figures stopped moving. Silence descended upon them, thick and suffocating. The figure that had risen from the coffin stepped forward again. This time, its voice was louder, more commanding. "You have awakened the curse, and now it will claim you all." Ethan, Sarah, and Jacob were paralyzed, unable to move or speak as the shadowy figures closed in on them. The chanting grew louder, and the world seemed to tilt, the ground beneath them no longer solid. Then, as quickly as it began, everything stopped. The figures froze, their empty eyes fixed on them, and for a moment, there was nothing but silence. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. Ethan, Sarah, and Jacob stood frozen, trapped in a nightmare they couldn't escape. The shadows surrounding them seemed to pulse with life, their movements subtle but undeniable. Each breath they took felt heavier than the last, and every passing second brought them closer to an inevitable fate. But then something changed. The figure that had spoken, the one who had risen from the coffin, stepped forward once more, its decaying face twisting into something that almost resembled a smile. It raised a skeletal hand, pointing directly at Ethan. "You will be the first." Ethan's heart skipped a beat. He felt a strange tug within him, as if the air itself were drawing him closer to the figure. It was an unnatural pull, like gravity itself had changed its laws. He took a half step back, but his legs refused to obey. The air around him grew unbearably cold, and he could feel his breath condense in front of him like smoke. The whispering voices returned, growing louder, more insistent, filling his mind with their incessant demands. "Come closer." The ground beneath him rumbled, and the darkness seemed to take on a life of its own, swirling around them. The mausoleum walls closed in, the oppressive weight of the tombs pressing against them. Ethan wanted to scream, but no sound came. Sarah's voice broke through the chaos. "Ethan! Fight it!" she shouted, her voice filled with desperation. But Ethan couldn't move. He was paralyzed, his mind clouded by the whispers, his body at the mercy of something ancient and malevolent. Then, as if driven by some primal instinct, Sarah ran toward him. Her hand grasped his, pulling him with a strength that surprised even him. "Ethan, snap out of it!" For a brief moment, their eyes met, and he could see the fear in Sarah's face. It was the first human connection he had felt since the curse had descended upon them. With a surge of willpower, Ethan shook his head. The whispers receded, and the suffocating pull lifted. He stumbled back, almost falling, but Sarah caught him. "Thank God," Jacob muttered, visibly shaken. I thought we were done for. The figure in front of them let out a low, guttural laugh. The sound echoed in their bones, a noise that seemed to seep into the very fabric of the air. You cannot escape, it hissed. You have awakened us, and now you will be part of us. The walls of the mausoleum trembled again, and with a horrifying crack, one of the tombs shifted, its stone lid lifting. From it emerged a new figure, a woman this time, her flesh barely clinging to her bones, her hollow eyes staring straight at them. She joined the first figure, her voice adding to the chorus of whispers. The curse cannot be broken. You are trapped in this cycle. The figures began to circle them once more, closing in like wolves around prey. Ethan, Sarah, and Jacob backed toward the door, but the iron gates remained sealed, as if mocking their every attempt to escape. The woman's voice grew louder, filling the space with an almost hypnotic cadence. You were never meant to leave. Your souls will be bound here forever, just as those before you. No! Ethan shouted, his voice filled with defiance. But the woman's smile twisted into something even darker. You have no power here, mortal. Your fate is sealed. The ground shook violently, and the mausoleum seemed to cave in on itself, the stone walls cracking like the shell of a dying creature. The figures closed in, their hands reaching out to grab them, their fingers like ice. Ethan's mind raced. There had to be a way out. Without thinking, he grabbed Sarah's hand and pulled her toward the far corner of the mausoleum. There, half hidden by the shadows, was an old, weathered door, barely visible under layers of decay. Over there! Ethan shouted. We need to get through that door. Jacob looked at it uncertainly. That thing? We don't know what's behind it. I don't care. Ethan snapped. If there's a chance, we take it. They ran for the door, their footsteps heavy and panicked as the figures pursued them. The door creaked open with surprising ease, revealing a narrow staircase descending into darkness. Without another word, they rushed inside, the door slamming shut behind them. The sudden darkness swallowed them whole, and for a moment, there was nothing but the pounding of their hearts and the deafening silence. Then, as their eyes adjusted, they saw what lay ahead. The staircase led down into a vast underground chamber, its walls adorned with strange markings and symbols. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and ancient decay. In the center of the chamber was an altar, covered in dark stains that glistened in the faint light. The altar was surrounded by hundreds of old, cracked skulls, their hollow eyes staring up at the ceiling. And standing at the center of the altar was something that made Ethan's blood run cold. A figure, a shadowed figure that seemed to be the source of the curse itself. Its eyes glowed with an unnatural light, and as it turned to face them, the ground beneath their feet rumbled once more. You should never have come. The figure at the altar stood motionless, its glowing eyes fixed on Ethan, Sarah, and Jacob. Its presence seemed to warp the air itself, bending the very light around it, casting long, twisting shadows that seemed to crawl along the walls. The air in the chamber grew suffocating, thick with the weight of something ancient, something malevolent. Ethan's heart raced. The figure was like nothing he had ever seen. It was humanoid in shape, but its form seemed to shift in and out of focus, as though it were made of smoke, shadows, and memories all at once. Its features were barely discernible, its face obscured by a veil of darkness, save for those eyes. Those eyes that burned into his soul. You are the one controlling all of this, Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. The figure didn't respond, but the very air seemed to hum with an ominous power. The chamber felt colder, as though the life was being drained from them, leaving only a hollow emptiness. The chanting that had filled the mausoleum before began again, but now it was louder, more intense, reverberating off the walls of the chamber. The words were unintelligible, an ancient language long forgotten by time. Yet, in the pit of his stomach, Ethan knew that the words held power, dark, unimaginable power. We need to get out of here, Jacob said, his voice strained. This place, it's a trap. All of it. But Ethan's feet felt like lead. The figure's gaze seemed to pull him forward, as though it were beckoning him to approach, to join it at the altar. No, Ethan muttered, shaking his head. We can't let it win. As if hearing his thoughts, the figure raised a skeletal hand and spoke in a voice that was both a whisper and a roar, filling the entire chamber. You cannot escape what is already in your blood. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. What do you mean? The figure's form began to solidify, taking on the shape of a tall, gaunt man draped in tattered robes. His face remained hidden in the darkness, but his voice echoed in the chamber like a death knell. This town, this land is bound to me, to the curse. You have awakened what was meant to remain asleep. And now, your souls are forfeit. The ground beneath them shook violently, sending Ethan crashing to his knees. The room spun, as though the very fabric of reality was being torn apart. The figure moved toward them, its form twisting with every step. You think you can break the curse? You cannot. I am the keeper of Black Hollow. I have been here longer than you can comprehend. Your ancestors, the ones who built this cemetery, called upon me for power. They did not understand the price, and now you will pay it. The air grew colder still, and Ethan felt a sharp pain in his chest, as if something was reaching inside him, twisting his very soul. Sarah cried out, her voice a mixture of fear and pain. Ethan, what's happening? Ethan struggled to breathe as a deep, resonant voice spoke inside his mind, sending a wave of terror through him. Your blood is tainted with the curse. Your family, your lineage is forever linked to this place. The very land calls to you. You were never meant to escape. Suddenly, everything fell silent. The rumbling ceased, the voices stopped, and the figure before them stood still, watching them with an expression that conveyed ancient sadness. But there is a way. Ethan's pulse quickened. A way out. The figure tilted its head, and for the first time, Ethan saw a glimpse of its face, pale, gaunt, and covered in deep cracks, as though the very essence of life had been drained from it long ago. Its eyes, glowing like embers in the darkness, locked onto his. A sacrifice must be made. The words hung in the air, cold and final. Ethan's mind raced. A sacrifice? What does that mean? The figure stepped forward, its movements unnaturally slow, as though the very air resisted its presence. A life must be given to balance the curse. One must join the land, just as your ancestors did. Only then will the curse be lifted. Ethan's blood ran cold. You want one of us to die? The figure's expression remained unchanged. Only then can the cycle be broken. Sarah gasped, clutching Ethan's arm. No, we won't let you have one of us. Jacob, who had been silent for what felt like an eternity, stepped forward. His voice was barely a whisper. What if we don't choose? What happens then? The figure's lips curled into a thin, malevolent smile. Then all of you will become part of the curse. Forever. The chamber seemed to close in on them, the walls pressing in as the weight of the decision bore down upon them. Ethan's heart thudded painfully in his chest. What choice did they have? To sacrifice one of their own seemed impossible, but to refuse would mean their souls would be trapped here, doomed to suffer for eternity. The figure's voice echoed once more. Time is running out. The curse is upon you all. Choose. The darkness around them deepened, suffocating. The air thick with dread, and the walls seemed to pulse with the rhythm of their hearts. Ethan took a shaky breath, his mind a storm of conflicting emotions. In the face of an impossible choice, one thing was certain. There was no turning back. The chamber seemed to close in around them, its cold stone walls pressing in like the grip of an unseen hand. Ethan, Sarah, and Jacob stood frozen, their minds racing, trying to make sense of the impossible choice before them. The figure, now fully manifested, stood at the altar waiting. Its gaze was unwavering, its eyes glowing with an ancient hunger. It spoke again, its voice resonating deep within their bones, an eerie calmness to its tone that belied the danger they faced. Choose or suffer. The curse does not wait. Sarah clutched Ethan's arm, her fingers trembling. There has to be another way, she whispered, though her voice was filled with uncertainty. Jacob, his face pale, his breath shallow, turned to Ethan. What do we do? We can't just give up someone's life. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest. The weight of their situation was crushing. There was no easy answer, no way to fix this without losing something precious. The price must be paid, the figure said, almost patiently, as though it had seen this moment play out countless times. You have awoken what should have remained buried. Now you must make your choice, for the land has already claimed you. Ethan swallowed hard, his mind spinning. The figure's words echoed in his thoughts. You were never meant to escape. The curse had been waiting for them, patiently biding its time. The town, the cemetery, all were bound to it, and now they were part of its twisted cycle. Sarah's voice cracked. I can't choose who. Jacob took a deep breath, and for the first time, he seemed to come to a decision. He stepped forward, his face hardened. If it's me, then it's me. I'll do it. Ethan turned to him in shock. What are you saying? No. But Jacob held up a hand, silencing him. We don't have a choice. Either we do this, or we all die here. Ethan's chest tightened. There has to be another way, he repeated, his voice barely a whisper. The figure remained silent for a long moment, its expression unreadable. Finally it spoke again. If none of you are willing to pay the price, then all will suffer. The curse will be set in motion. The land will claim its due. Ethan's blood ran cold. The implications of the figure's words settled over him like a shroud. There was no escaping this place. The curse would not allow them to leave, not unless one of them paid the ultimate price. A sense of desperation began to build inside Ethan. He couldn't lose them. He couldn't let his friends sacrifice themselves. But how could he possibly make a decision? Wait! Ethan shouted, his voice cutting through the tension. What if we offer the curse something else? What if we offer it something more? The figure's glowing eyes narrowed slightly, as though intrigued by Ethan's proposal. More? What could you offer that could undo the curse? Ethan took a step toward the figure, his mind racing with an idea, however reckless. The cemetery, he said, his voice growing steadier. The land. It's the land that is cursed, right? What if we offer the land itself? The figure tilted its head, considering the offer. You would give up the land, the very heart of the curse? Ethan nodded, swallowing his fear. Yes. We'll leave. We'll walk away and you can have the land, but in exchange we all go free. No more suffering. No more curses. There was a long silence. Ethan's heart hammered in his chest as the figure stared at him, unblinking. The weight of the moment pressed down on him like a physical force, and for a fleeting second, he wondered if he had made a terrible mistake. Finally, the figure spoke. The land will claim what is rightfully its own, but the price will remain. No matter what you offer, the curse will not be lifted so easily. You cannot escape it without loss. Ethan's chest tightened. Then what do we do? Tell me what to do. The figure stepped forward, its form now so close that Ethan could feel the cold emanating from it, a chill that sank deep into his bones. You must offer your blood, a sacrifice that binds your fate to the land. Only then will the curse be broken. The words echoed in Ethan's mind. Blood. The price of salvation was blood. His blood. Ethan's hand shook as he reached for his wrist, his heart pounding louder in his ears. He had never believed in the supernatural, in curses or rituals, but now it was too real. A soft voice broke through the fear in his mind. It was Sarah's. Ethan, no. She stepped toward him, her eyes filled with sorrow. We can't do this. We can't let you give up your life. Ethan turned to her, his expression desperate. I can't let it be any of you. I can't let you die here in this place. If it has to be me, then it has to be me. The figure's voice rose in an eerie harmony with the chanting that filled the chamber. The blood must be spilled willingly. Ethan knew what he had to do. There was no other way. He stepped forward, toward the altar, his heart racing. His life had led him here, to this moment, to this choice. And he would face it, whatever the cost. With one last glance at Sarah and Jacob, he raised his hand to the figure. Take my blood. Ethan's pulse thundered in his ears as the figure in front of him reached forward, its skeletal hand brushing against his outstretched arm. The coldness of its touch sent a wave of icy terror through him, but he didn't pull away. This was it, the final moment. Sarah and Jacob stood in stunned silence, unable to speak, watching him with a mix of fear, sorrow, and desperation. Ethan could see the pain in Sarah's eyes. She didn't want him to do this, didn't want him to die for them. But he knew there was no other choice. He closed his eyes, bracing himself for what was to come. Do not resist, the figure whispered, its voice like the rustling of dead leaves. The ancient power in the figure's words seeped into Ethan's soul, wrapping around him like chains. The land was calling for this sacrifice, and there was no turning back. Ethan felt the sharp sting of its fingers on his wrist. The figure's hand tightened, and a cold, unseen force dragged him toward the altar. He could hear the chanting growing louder, filling the air with an almost hypnotic cadence. A dark energy seemed to pulse from the altar itself, from the very stones beneath his feet. It felt as if the ground were alive, hungry, pulling at him, dragging him closer to the heart of the curse. The whispers swirled around him like 1,000 voices, each one speaking in a different tongue, but all united in their desire for his blood. Wait! Sarah shouted, rushing toward him, but Jacob caught her, pulling her back. No! You can't stop it! Ethan's vision blurred as the figure's power enveloped him. His heart hammered faster as a searing pain shot through his arm, his blood flowing from his veins like an unstoppable river. The figure's hand remained steady, and the blood began to pool on the altar, turning the stone dark as if it were drinking it in. The power in the room was overwhelming, an all-consuming force that threatened to swallow him whole. The ground beneath him trembled, and the shadows seemed to stretch and twist around him like hungry tendrils. He could feel his strength leaving him, his life draining away with every drop of blood spilled. You give yourself willingly, the figure crooned, its voice a low murmur, as if savoring every moment. Your soul is bound to this place now, bound to the curse. You will never be free, just as I am never free. Ethan's body felt weak, his vision swimming. His knees buckled, but the figure held him up, its grip like iron. He gasped for breath, the world around him dimming. But in that moment of agony something shifted. A flicker of defiance sparked inside him. He couldn't let it end like this. He refused to let this be the end of their story, the end of their fight. With every ounce of strength he had left, Ethan raised his head and locked eyes with the figure. He could feel the curse pressing in, trying to drag him under, but he pushed back. He had to make it stop. I will not be part of you, Ethan gritted out, his voice shaky but determined. I won't let you take me. The figure's smile twisted, its eyes narrowing. You are already mine. Your blood is my blood. Your fate is sealed. Ethan closed his eyes, summoning every ounce of willpower he had left. He knew he couldn't fight the curse with force, but maybe, just maybe, he could outweed it. Let go of him. Sarah screamed, her voice raw with desperation. She struggled against Jacob's grip, but he held her back. The figure's eyes flickered toward her, and for a moment, there was hesitation in its dark gaze. Ethan could sense the shift, the tiniest crack in the curse's hold. No, the figure hissed. You cannot escape. You are bound. All of you. But Ethan's mind was working faster now, his thoughts sharp and clear despite the pain. He remembered the land, the history of Black Hollow, the whispers he had heard from the very beginning. The curse had been born here, bound to the cemetery, to the very earth itself. But if the land could be bound to the curse, then perhaps the land could be freed as well. With a sudden surge of energy, Ethan twisted in the figure's grasp, pulling away just enough to break the connection. His blood, still dripping from his arm, splattered across the altar, and the earth beneath them groaned as if in response. What are you doing? The figure snarled. You cannot defy me. You are nothing. But Ethan didn't listen. He knew what he had to do. The curse was rooted in the land, but the land had been corrupted, poisoned by the blood of the innocent, by the sins of the past. If he could sever the connection between the land and the curse, perhaps it would break. Perhaps they could all be free. I offer this blood, Ethan murmured, his voice trembling. Not to feed the curse, but to end it. I offer it to the earth, to the land that has suffered. He placed his bleeding wrist against the altar, pressing it into the stone, and for the briefest of moments, everything went still. The figure recoiled, its form flickering. No, you fool. The ground trembled violently, as if the very bones of the earth were shaking. The walls of the chamber cracked, and a blinding light erupted from the altar, engulfing the room in a pulse of pure energy. Ethan cried out as the light consumed him, his body racked with pain, his blood searing through his veins. The air around him seemed to distort, rippling like water in a storm. Then, everything went silent. The light faded. The chamber was still. The ground no longer trembled. Ethan collapsed to the floor, his body weak and trembling. He could barely breathe, but he could hear Sarah and Jacob rushing to his side. The curse had been broken, but at what cost? Ethan! Sarah cried, her voice shaking. Ethan, are you okay? Ethan blinked, struggling to focus. His body was exhausted, his blood still dripping from his wrist, but there was a sense of peace now. The land had been freed. The curse was no more. I think we're free, he whispered, his voice hoarse. The figure, the one that had haunted them throughout their journey, was gone. There was no sign of it, no trace of its dark power. For the first time since they had entered Black Hollow Cemetery, the air felt lighter. The weight that had pressed on them for so long had lifted. They had done it. They had broken the curse. But at what cost? Ethan lay on the cold stone floor, his breath shallow, his body a mere shell of its former strength. He could hear Sarah and Jacob's voices in the distance, but they seemed muffled, as if the world itself were holding its breath, waiting. The chamber was eerily quiet. The oppressive weight of the curse that had hung over Black Hollow Cemetery for so long had finally lifted. But the silence felt unnatural, as though something was missing, as though the earth itself was mourning. Sarah's hands were trembling as she gently pressed her palm to Ethan's forehead, brushing the damp strands of hair from his face. Ethan, please talk to me. Are you all right? Her voice was strained, filled with worry and relief in equal measure. Ethan blinked, forcing his eyes to focus on her. I'm okay, he managed to say, though his voice was barely above a whisper. I think we're safe now. Jacob knelt beside him, his expression a mixture of disbelief and exhaustion. Safe? Ethan, he stopped himself, shaking his head as if unable to fully comprehend what had just happened. Ethan forced himself to sit up, wincing at the dizziness that swept over him. He looked around the chamber, his gaze falling on the altar where the curse had been broken. The stone was still wet with his blood, but there was no sign of the malevolent figure, no more whispers or shadows. The air had returned to its natural stillness, the oppressive weight of darkness gone. But something felt different. A quiet sorrow lingered, hanging in the air like an unspoken grief. "It's over," Ethan murmured, though doubt crept into his words. "But did we really break it?" Sarah looked at him, her brow furrowed with concern. "What do you mean?" "The figure's gone. The curse is broken." Ethan slowly shook his head, his gaze drifting toward the walls of the mausoleum. The shadows that had once seemed to twist with malevolent intent were now still, but something about them felt wrong. Out of place. "I don't know," he said softly. "It's just too quiet." Jacob stood up, his voice low and steady. "We've been through hell, Ethan. I think we need to get out of here. Now." Ethan nodded, but as he stood with their help, a sudden wave of nausea hit him. He felt weak, as though the very ground beneath him was shifting unsteady. He took a few unsteady steps forward, his hand gripping Sarah's shoulder for support. "I don't know if I can make it," he admitted, his legs barely holding him up. Sarah frowned. "You're exhausted. You gave everything. We just need to get back to the surface." But as they began to make their way toward the exit, the ground trembled beneath their feet. A low rumble reverberated through the chamber, followed by a sound like the cracking of stone. "Not again," Jacob muttered, his voice tinged with panic. Ethan's heart skipped a beat as the rumble grew louder. He could feel the earth beneath them shift, as if something massive was moving beneath their feet. Then, the walls of the chamber seemed to warp, the stones groaning in protest. The air thickened, and a deep, guttural growl echoed through the cavern. "No," Ethan breathed, fear creeping into his chest. "This isn't over." The floor beneath them split with a violent jolt, sending them all tumbling to the ground. Ethan's head slammed against the cold stone, and for a moment, everything went black. When he opened his eyes again, he was lying on the floor, his vision blurry. The ground continued to shake, and a terrible screeching sound filled the air, as if the very earth itself were tearing apart. Sarah was shaking him, her voice frantic. "Ethan! Ethan, wake up!" Ethan's eyes focused, and he saw the walls of the mausoleum crack, chunks of stone falling away. There was something rising from the cracks, something dark, something alive. "Get up!" Jacob shouted, pulling Ethan to his feet with surprising strength. "We need to go now." Ethan stumbled, his legs unsteady, as they rushed toward the exit. But the ground was still shaking, the walls crumbling, and the darkness that had once been sealed in the earth was now breaking free. As they reached the exit, Ethan turned one last time, glancing back at the chaos unfolding behind them. The earth had split open, revealing an ancient, pulsing heart, dark and writhing, as if the land itself were alive and angry. But it wasn't the heart of the curse. No, this was something older, something deeper, something that had been waiting beneath the cemetery for centuries. As they stumbled up the stairs toward the surface, Ethan's mind raced. They had broken the curse, but had they truly freed the land? Or had they simply awakened something far worse? "Come on!" Sarah shouted, urging him forward. "We can't stop now." They emerged into the moonlight, and for a moment, the world felt still. The cemetery stretched out before them, silent and empty. The tombstones cast long shadows across the ground, but there was no sign of the darkness that had plagued them. The curse had been broken. The land was no longer bound to the figure that had tormented them. But the heart of Black Hollow Cemetery had not been silenced. Ethan looked out at the cemetery, his heart heavy with the realization. The curse might have been broken, but the land would never be the same. And neither would they. The moon hung low in the sky, casting a pale light across the cemetery. Ethan, Sarah, and Jacob stood at the edge of the mausoleum, breathing heavily, their clothes torn and caked with dust. The weight of what had just happened pressed down on them like an unseen force. The tremors had stopped, the earth had settled, but something still felt wrong. Ethan glanced over his shoulder, his heart sinking as he saw the fissures in the ground where the earth had split open. The dark, pulsing heart of the land, the source of all the corruption, was now exposed, its twisted form still writhing, as if it were searching for something that had been taken from it. Sarah shook her head, her face pale. "This isn't over. It can't be. That thing, it's not just the curse. It's something more." Ethan didn't respond. He didn't need to. He could feel it too, the lingering presence, the sinister energy that still clung to the land. They had broken the curse, yes, but what they had awakened might be far worse than anything they could have imagined. Jacob clenched his fists, his jaw set with determination. We need to destroy it. Whatever it is, it can't be allowed to survive. It's been festering here for centuries. We need to finish what we started. Ethan looked at him, but there was a flicker of hesitation in his eyes. I don't know, Jacob. That thing, it's not just some curse. It feels ancient, older than anything we've ever seen. We might be dealing with something that can't be killed. Sarah stepped closer to Ethan, her voice steady but filled with fear. But we can't just leave it. It will keep calling to us, to anyone who comes near. It will consume everything in its path. We have to stop it, once and for all. Ethan closed his eyes, his mind racing. He thought back to the chamber, to the altar where he had spilled his blood. Had he truly broken the curse? Or had he only set the stage for something darker? The land had been waiting for them, hungry for their blood, for their pain. It had taken his blood, but it had not satisfied its hunger. How do we destroy it? Ethan asked, his voice barely a whisper. Jacob looked to the mausoleum, his eyes scanning the wreckage. I don't know, but we'll figure it out. We can't let it win. Ethan nodded, but deep down a gnawing fear took root. The ground beneath his feet felt unstable, as if it were shifting, ready to swallow them whole. They had made a terrible mistake. They had thought they could outsmart the curse, but the land was much more powerful than they had realized. And now, the heart of Black Hollow Cemetery was awake. It was waiting. Let's go, Sarah said, her voice firm. We have to end this before it's too late. As they turned and began to move toward the cemetery's heart, the ground groaned beneath them. The air seemed to thicken, and a shadow fell across the moonlit path. For a brief moment, the world went still. Ethan stopped, his senses on high alert. The wind picked up, swirling around them, carrying with it whispers, low and indistinct at first, but growing louder, clearer. Ethan strained to make out the words, his heart racing. You should never have come back. The voice was deep, ancient, a sound that reverberated through the very earth beneath his feet. It wasn't the figure from the mausoleum. It was something far older. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, until it felt as though the very land itself was speaking to them, mocking them for their foolishness. You can't stop what's already begun, the voice continued. I've waited too long to be free. You cannot undo what has been set in motion. Ethan's stomach turned. The land wasn't just cursed, it was alive. And it was angry. The whispers turned to a growl, deep and guttural, as the earth began to shift once more. The heart of the cemetery pulsed violently, the ground around it cracking open like a wound that had never healed. From the cracks, shadows began to emerge, twisting, writhing, and coiling around the cemetery like serpents. This is it, Sarah whispered, her face pale with fear. It's too powerful. Jacob clenched his fists. We're not backing down now. We finish this. But even as he spoke, the ground trembled beneath their feet, and a figure rose from the cracks in the earth. A massive, shadowy form, black as night, its body shifting like smoke, and its eyes glowing with an unnatural light. The land had birthed something far darker than they had imagined. Ethan, look out! Sarah screamed as the shadow surged toward them. Ethan barely had time to react. The air around him grew cold, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The shadow loomed over them, its eyes burning into his soul, and he realized, with a sinking feeling, that this was not just a curse. It was a manifestation of the land's deepest darkness, something born from the very blood and suffering that had seeped into the earth for centuries. We have to destroy it, Ethan gasped, his voice trembling. This thing, it's the source of all of it. Jacob stepped forward, brandishing a broken shard of stone from the altar. I'm not letting it take us. But the shadow laughed, a low, rumbling sound that echoed in their bones, a sound that made Ethan's blood freeze. You cannot kill me, it said. I am not bound to time. I am not bound to your feeble world. I am the land, and the land will never be free. The figure's form began to expand, dark tendrils reaching out like claws, closing in on them. Ethan could feel the weight of its presence pushing down on him, suffocating him with its malice. It was like the earth itself had come alive to devour them. But Ethan refused to give in. He remembered the ritual, the blood he had spilled, the words that had echoed through the mausoleum. If the land had power over him, then maybe, just maybe, he could turn that power against it. With a surge of energy, he stepped forward, forcing himself to stand tall in the face of the shadow. I am the blood of the land. I am its past and its future, and I will not let it destroy me. The shadow recoiled as if stung, its tendrils writhing in agitation. Foolish human, it hissed. You do not understand the forces you meddle with. You cannot define me. Ethan closed his eyes and focused, reaching deep into the very core of the land. He could feel the energy, the pulse of the earth beneath his feet, the heartbeat of Black Hollow Cemetery. It was strong, powerful, but it was not invincible. And neither was the creature that had risen from it. With a final, desperate cry, Ethan extended his hands, channeling everything he had into the earth, summoning the strength of the land itself. The shadow shrieked as the ground beneath it cracked open wider, and the dark tendrils began to fade, disintegrating into nothingness. The land groaned, the heartbeat of Black Hollow Cemetery faltering, as if it were gasping for breath. And then finally it stopped. The shadow was gone. The earth fell silent. Ethan collapsed to his knees, exhausted and battered, but alive. "We did it," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling with relief. "We finally did it." Jacob nodded, his face pale but resolute. "We ended it. It's over." But as they stood together in the eerie silence, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. The land had been freed, yes, but it had taken so much more than they had ever realized. And even now, deep in the recesses of Black Hollow Cemetery, he wondered if the true heart of the land had finally been silenced, or if it was only lying dormant, waiting for the next blood to awaken it. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and the remnants of the ancient curse that had plagued Black Hollow Cemetery for centuries. Ethan stood at the edge of the cemetery, his breath ragged as the remnants of the shadow dissipated into the ground. The moonlight bathed the gravestones, casting long shadows across the cemetery, but there was no longer the palpable sense of dread that had clung to the air like a heavy fog. It was over, or so they hoped. Ethan wiped the sweat from his brow, his body trembling with exhaustion. He looked over at Sarah and Jacob, both of them equally worn but visibly relieved. "Did we really do it?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. Sarah stepped closer, her eyes scanning the cemetery with a wary expression. "I think so," she said, though her voice lacked conviction. "The shadow's gone, and the land feels still. But I can't shake the feeling that something's watching us." Ethan nodded, his unease growing. "I know what you mean. It feels like we've just disturbed something, but it's still there, waiting." Jacob shook his head, his eyes narrowing as he turned to face the cemetery's heart, the place where the fissures had opened, where the dark presence had once thrived. "It's over. We've destroyed it." But as they stood there in silence, the wind picked up again, this time carrying with it a soft, haunting whisper, so faint that it could have been the rustle of leaves, but it carried a dark weight to it. "Did you hear that?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. Ethan's heart skipped a beat as the whispers grew louder, clearer, as though something beneath the earth was calling to them. He took a step back, suddenly filled with the overwhelming sense of being drawn into the depths of the cemetery once again. "Something's wrong," Jacob said, his voice low and full of unease. The whispers continued, but they were not just whispers. They were words. Dark, ancient words. "You have not finished your task." Ethan froze. The voice was not the same as the shadows. It was deeper, more primal, and unmistakably from the earth itself. "No," Ethan whispered. "It can't be. We broke the curse. We destroyed it." But as he said the words, a deep rumbling echoed from beneath the cemetery. The earth began to tremble again, more violently this time. The ground cracked, fissures spreading like veins across the cemetery, and the once dead trees around them began to sway, their branches creaking as though alive. Ethan could feel the energy shifting, twisting. The land was reacting to something that had been disturbed, something that had been hidden deep below for far too long. "I told you," the voice boomed, now so loud that the earth seemed to shudder in response. "You cannot destroy me." The ground opened up wide before them, and from the depths of the earth, a dark, shadowy form began to rise, an enormous figure that stretched high into the night sky. The earth itself seemed to give birth to it, the blackness spilling out like oil, thick and viscous. Ethan stepped back, his heart pounding in his chest. What is this?" Jacob's eyes widened in horror. This is no curse. This is something far older. Something that has been here since the beginning." The figure loomed over them, its form shifting and writhing, taking shape like a monstrous amalgamation of smoke and shadow. Its eyes, burning with an unnatural light, locked onto Ethan, piercing him with an ancient hatred. "You have disturbed the land's deepest secret," it growled, its voice resonating in Ethan's chest. "And for that, you will pay the price." A gust of wind howled through the cemetery, carrying with it the weight of centuries of suffering. The ground seemed to open wider, the fissures spreading further, as though the very earth itself was tearing apart to release the dark force that had been imprisoned within. "We need to stop it," Sarah cried, her voice rising in panic. Ethan's mind raced. They had thought they had ended it. But this wasn't the curse. This was something more. The land had not been freed. It had only been awakened. We need to find a way to stop it, Jacob shouted, his voice filled with desperation. The monstrous figure let out a deep, guttural laugh that echoed through the cemetery, shaking the very air. You cannot stop me. I am the earth's blood. I am the shadow that sleeps in the heart of this place. I am the beginning and the end. And you are nothing. Ethan felt his heart race, but in the depths of his terror, something inside him stirred. The blood of the land, the power that had coursed through him when he had broken the curse, was still within him. It was faint, but it was there. Sarah, Ethan shouted. Jacob, we have to fight it with the land. The earth can still hear us. We can still. But before he could finish, the dark figure lunged, its tendrils stretching out to seize them. With a cry of terror, Sarah dodged to the side, narrowly avoiding the tendrils as they sliced through the air with deadly force. Jacob grabbed Ethan's arm, pulling him away from the oncoming shadow. Move! We can't outrun it. Ethan's mind raced. He didn't know how to fight something like this. He didn't know if it could even be defeated. But he knew one thing. The land was still alive, still connected to them in some way. If they could harness its power again. Sarah, Jacob, Ethan shouted, his voice hoarse with urgency. We need to focus. We need to connect with the land, feel its heartbeat. Together, we can control it. For a brief moment, Sarah and Jacob hesitated, their faces filled with uncertainty. But then, as the figure rose higher, as its tendrils whipped toward them, they nodded in unison. Ethan closed his eyes, breathing deeply as he tried to center himself. He felt the ground beneath him, the pulse of the earth, slow but steady like a heartbeat. The land was speaking to him again, urging him to listen, to understand. We can do this, Ethan whispered to himself, though doubt still gnawed at the edges of his mind. The figure was too powerful, too ancient. But there had to be a way to stop it. They couldn't let this land destroy everything. With a sudden, forceful motion, Ethan extended his hands toward the figure, focusing all of his energy on the earth. He could feel the land's energy surge through him, responding to his call. The ground beneath the figure trembled as Ethan directed the earth to fight back. Help us, he whispered, his voice a prayer. Help us end this. The ground exploded in a burst of energy, as though the very heart of the cemetery was fighting back against the dark force that had risen. The figure screeched in rage, its tendrils writhing and snapping, but the earth seemed to push back, lifting massive stones from the ground, hurling them at the figure with terrifying force. For a brief moment, it seemed as though the land itself might win, but the figure was not easily defeated. It howled in fury, sending a wave of darkness surging through the cemetery, swallowing everything in its path. Ethan's hands trembled, his energy waning. But he couldn't give up. Not now. Focus! Jacob shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos. We need to finish it. Together. And so, with one final surge of strength, Ethan, Sarah, and Jacob pressed their hands into the ground, their minds linked in a single, focused thought: destroy the darkness. The land responded. With a deafening roar, the ground split open, and the shadow was torn apart, its form disintegrating into ash. The earth was still. The wind had stilled. The heart of Black Hollow Cemetery was quiet once more. But as they stood there, catching their breath, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that the land was still watching them, waiting, perhaps, for the next time they would disturb its depths. The cemetery was eerily still, the once overwhelming presence of darkness now absent. Yet, the silence was not comforting. It felt hollow, like a breath that had been held too long, waiting to be exhaled. Ethan, Sarah, and Jacob stood in the aftermath of the chaos, their hearts pounding with the remnants of fear and the uncertainty of what they had just faced. The land had calmed, but it had not healed. It felt like a wound that had been stitched shut, but still throbbed with unseen pain beneath the surface. We did it, Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. Her hands were shaking, her face pale, but there was a flicker of relief in her eyes. Jacob nodded, though his expression was tense, his eyes scanning the cemetery. For now we did, but I don't think it's really over. There's something more, something we still don't understand. Ethan turned to face his friends, his mind spinning with the same thoughts. They had fought the shadow, they had fought the curse, and they had driven the darkness away. But something in the back of his mind told him that Black Hollow Cemetery was not so easily appeased. The land had shown them a glimpse of its true power, a power that had been buried for centuries, and though it had been wounded, it was not vanquished. Jacob's right, Ethan said, his voice grim. This place, this land, it's not like anything we've ever encountered before. It's ancient. It's not just cursed, it's alive in a way that we can't understand. Sarah shook her head. We fought it off. That should be enough, right? We've ended it. Ethan met her gaze, his eyes full of the doubt he hadn't been able to shake since that last, terrifying confrontation. I hope you're right, Sarah. But I don't think we can ever truly end something like this. The curse, the shadow, it's not a story with a clear beginning and end. It's a part of the land itself. It's been here long before us, and it will likely remain long after we're gone. Jacob's voice was quieter now, but there was a heavy weight in it. The hollow's darkness doesn't just come from the dead. It's a reflection of something much older, something we're only beginning to understand. What if we've only scratched the surface of it? Ethan took a deep breath, his mind racing. The cemetery had been a place of torment for so long, but the land itself, the ground they stood on, held far deeper secrets than they had anticipated. It was as though the cemetery was more than just a burial ground. It was a nexus, a place where the boundaries between the living and the dead had worn thin over centuries of suffering and sacrifice. Maybe there's still more to discover, Ethan murmured, glancing at the horizon. The night had grown deeper, the shadows around them stretching into an abyss. But for now we need to leave. We've done all we can here. But as they began to walk back toward the entrance, their steps slow and reluctant, a sound halted them, an echo in the distance. At first, it was faint, barely noticeable, but as it grew louder, their hearts skipped. Help us! The voice was distant, almost inaudible, but unmistakably human. It came from deep within the cemetery, from somewhere beyond the veil of shadows that still clung to the land. Ethan's eyes widened. Did you hear that? He asked, his voice tight with apprehension. Sarah and Jacob exchanged worried glances. We're hearing things, Sarah said, though her voice trembled with doubt. But Ethan shook his head, his instincts on high alert. No, that was real. Someone, or something, is still out there. They turned back toward the heart of the cemetery, the whispers growing louder, more desperate, more urgent. Help us! This time, the voice was clearer, its sorrow palpable. It was not a call for salvation, but a cry for release. Ethan's breath caught in his throat as he realized what it was. The land had not only consumed the living, it had claimed the dead. It had trapped them, bound them in an eternal cycle of torment. We can't just leave, he said, his voice heavy with resolve. We have to find out who's still here. Who's still trapped? Are you crazy? Jacob snapped, grabbing Ethan's arm. We've done enough. We've already fought a battle we didn't understand. What if we wake something worse? Ethan pulled away, his gaze fixed on the darkened cemetery. I can't leave them. Whatever this is, it's still alive. The land isn't free. Not yet. Sarah stepped forward, her face filled with determination. Ethan's right. We didn't come this far just to walk away. We need to see this through, whatever it is. With no other choice, they turned back toward the deepest part of Black Hollow Cemetery, following the whispers, the calls, deeper into the unknown. The ground trembled beneath their feet as they made their way through the overgrown paths, the shadows closing in around them. Every step they took seemed to draw them closer to the heart of the land, to the very source of the darkness that had plagued it for centuries. Finally, they reached a clearing at the center of the cemetery, where an ancient oak tree stood, its twisted branches reaching out like the gnarled fingers of a long-dead corpse. Beneath the tree, the ground was soft, disturbed as though something, or someone, had been buried there long ago. Here, Ethan whispered, his voice tight. This is where it started. The whispers were deafening now, echoing from the earth itself. The soil shifted beneath them, and the ground cracked open, revealing a stone altar, old, weathered, and covered in moss. Atop the altar lay a single, shattered object, a relic, perhaps, from a time long past. Ethan knelt down, his fingers brushing the relic. It was a medallion, tarnished and worn by age, but its symbol was still recognizable. An ancient seal, one that he had seen before in the mausoleum. It was a symbol of the hollow, of the land's curse. But this medallion had a dark, eerie energy radiating from it. This, Ethan said softly, this is what kept them here. The souls. The ones who were lost. As his fingers grazed the medallion, a surge of energy shot through him, stronger than anything he had felt before. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, and a cold wind howled through the clearing. The medallion pulsed with a dark light, as though it were calling out to something buried deep beneath the earth. The ground trembled once more, and a voice, far older and more powerful than any they had heard, rose from the depths. You cannot leave now. Ethan's heart skipped a beat as he stood up quickly, the reality of what was happening crashing over him. The land had been waiting for them, waiting for someone to unlock the final piece of its cursed legacy. The souls trapped here had been bound to this place by the medallion, an artifact of unspeakable power, a key to the Hollow's darkest secrets. And now, they were about to face what had been waiting for them all along. Ethan took a deep breath, his resolve hardening. They had come too far to turn back now. The land had taken so much, and now it was time to uncover its final truth, the truth that would end the curse, or seal their fates forever. "We finished this," Ethan said, his voice steady despite the terror that gnawed at his insides. And as the whispers grew louder, the earth beneath them began to stir once again. Ethan knew that the final battle for Black Hollow Cemetery had just begun. The wind howled through the ancient trees surrounding the clearing, whipping Ethan's hair into his face as the cold bite of the night settled into his bones. His fingers still hovered over the medallion, which had begun to glow faintly, as if responding to the intense pull of the land around them. The whispers continued, louder and more frantic now, their tones blending with the groaning of the earth itself. "You cannot leave now." The voice echoed from deep within the soil, almost as if it were coming from the very bones of the cemetery. Ethan stood, a shiver running down his spine as the weight of the moment pressed down on him. He turned to Sarah and Jacob, who stood just behind him, their faces pale, eyes wide with terror. "We have to do this," Ethan said, his voice low but firm. "We've come too far to turn back now. This is the heart of the curse. We have to break it, or it'll never stop." Jacob clenched his fists, his body stiff with fear but determination. "What do we do? This place, it feels alive." "I don't know," Ethan admitted, his voice strained. "But the medallion, this is the key. It's tied to the curse, to the land. We need to find out what it's hiding." Sarah stepped forward, her voice trembling but resolute. "Whatever's buried here, we have to unearth it. We can't let it stay buried forever." They all knelt around the altar, their eyes locked onto the medallion, which pulsed with an eerie glow. Ethan reached for it, but before he could touch it, the ground beneath them began to shift. The air grew thick with a suffocating energy as the whispers grew into a crescendo of voices. "The land is ours. The curse is eternal. You are the last to disturb us." Suddenly, the earth cracked open in a violent burst. Ethan and the others scrambled back as a blackened hand shot up from the ground, followed by another, and then an entire form, clad in ragged robes, its face obscured by shadows. The figure emerged, dark and imposing, the very embodiment of the curse that had plagued Black Hollow for centuries. Ethan's heart raced. This wasn't a simple spirit, nor was it merely a shadow. This was something much older, something born from the very foundation of the land. The figure's hollow eyes gleamed with a dark, unholy light as it slowly rose, its feet barely touching the ground. "We are the keepers," it whispered, its voice low and ancient, a voice that seemed to come from the depths of the earth itself. "The souls that were trapped, bound to the land by the cursed relic. And you have awakened us." Ethan felt his stomach twist in horror. "Who? What are you?" "We are the ones who fell into the hollow," the figure replied, its voice like the sound of cracking stone. "We were the first, the original settlers, those who dug the graves and buried our sins in the earth. But we were punished for our transgressions, cursed to remain here, bound to the land forever." The figure raised a hand, and with it, the ground seemed to warp, twisting around them as though the cemetery itself was alive, feeding off their fear. "You have disturbed us. You have awakened the curse. And now, you must take our place." Ethan's breath caught in his throat. The land had not only cursed the souls buried here, it had consumed them, trapped them in a cycle of endless torment. The medallion, the key to this dark power, had been used to trap their souls, feeding the curse for centuries. And now, Ethan realized, it was trying to take them, to force them into the same fate. "We won't become like you," Ethan said, his voice hoarse but defiant. "We won't let the curse claim us." The figure's eyes narrowed, its shadowy form growing larger. "You have no choice. The land is ours to control. And now it will claim you, as it has claimed so many before you." Suddenly, the medallion in Ethan's hand flared brightly, sending a pulse of energy through the air. The figure recoiled, hissing in pain, its form flickering as if it were struggling to remain intact. The medallion was not just a key, it was also a weapon, a tool of power that could force the curse back into the earth. Ethan realized what they had to do. "We have to use it. We can't just destroy it. We have to send them back into the land." Jacob and Sarah nodded, their faces set with resolve. Together, Sarah said, her voice trembling but strong. Ethan raised the medallion high, focusing every ounce of his will into it. The shadows around them writhed, the figure reaching out with a desperate, screeching howl. You cannot banish us. We are the Hollow. We are eternal. But as the light from the medallion intensified, the figure began to crumble, its form breaking apart like dust. The land shook violently, and for a moment, Ethan thought the very earth would swallow them whole. But then, with one final burst of light, the figure shattered completely, and the ground fell silent. The whispers ceased. The air cleared. The oppressive energy that had weighed on them for so long lifted, leaving only the faintest echo of the land's sorrowful past. Ethan stood panting, staring at the remnants of the altar, where only the broken medallion remained. He had done it. They had done it. They had freed the land. But at what cost? Sarah stepped forward, her eyes wide as she looked around. It's over. I think we did it. Jacob knelt down, picking up the shattered pieces of the medallion. It's over. But something about this place, it doesn't feel right. I can still feel the weight of it. Ethan's gaze lingered on the cemetery, his heart heavy. The curse is gone. But the land, it will never be the same. We've freed the souls, but there will always be a part of this place that will remain. Haunted? Sarah suggested. Yes, Ethan said, his voice low. Haunted. By everything that has happened here. By everything we've done. Jacob sighed and stood. We should leave. We've done what we came for. The land may be free, but we need to walk away from it now. Whatever happens, we can't be part of it anymore. The three of them turned and walked away, the air behind them growing calm, the first signs of dawn breaking over the horizon. Black Hollow Cemetery, once a place of deep horror and suffering, now lay in silence, its dark past fading into the light of a new day. But even as they left, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed within him, within all of them. They had faced the darkness, survived it, but the land had left its mark. Some places, he realized, never let go. They remain, alive with the echoes of their past, waiting, always waiting for the next soul to disturb them. As they reached the edge of the cemetery, Ethan took one last glance over his shoulder. The hollow lay still, its shadows retreating into the distance. For now it was over. But he knew better than anyone that some stories never truly end. And some curses, no matter how broken, remain forever etched into the land.